Well, hello there, and welcome to kind of a pilot episode of a new video series we're maybe trying to kick off. I'm Corny Swiss,
I'm Corny Phil.
and this video series is going to be mainly crowd-driven, audience-driven, but for the pilot, I guess, we're going to discuss a topic that we've chosen, and that topic is the battle rating system in War Thunder. Now, before you get your pitchforks out, this won't be a rage video. This is going to be a high level and as unbiased as possible discussion on the system, how it operates, why it's, I guess, why someone would use it over another one, and then whether we think it's at large good or bad, and then go into alternatives if you know, whatever,
If such exists.
if such exists. So, without further ado, let's start with kind of a high-level overview of what the system is. The battle rating system is essentially a method of ranking tanks for the matchmaking system. In theory, the battle rating system has a 1.0 BR range spread. So that means if you are driving a 4.0 battle rating tank or plane, you, in theory, will only see tanks or planes that are within plus or minus 1 of your battle rating, so up to 5.0 and down to 3.0. In practice, I've occasionally run into situations where the spread has actually been about 1.3, but I think that's primarily due to maybe high queue times or low player population at that time. So the spread gets a tiny bit larger to basically get the people on the edges into the game so games can happen, which is a system that is present in just about every matchmaking system. So that's the battle rating system at a whole. It's a tool the matchmaker uses to sort of plug people into games. One advantage of the battle rating system is that when playing machines are given a number, they're not put into, because in the battle rating system, I guess to preface this point, tier and rank really don't matter. They're almost a second thought. Like a rank 5 tank with a 6.7 battle rating is basically a rank 4 tank. The only difference is the research bonuses and the actual reward for the tank. Rank 5 tanks generally receive a higher reward than rank 4 tanks, which is kind of how it should be. You have to go through more to get to rank 5 than you do to get to rank 4. So, in theory, the battle rating of a machine is the only thing that matters. Rank really doesn't play any part of it. This means that when it comes time to update and change, or a tank is over tiered or under tiered, it's very easy for developers to come in and just tweak that battle rating and put them into a new range. In World of Tanks, for example, if for example, let's say the KV-1 was determined to be brokenly overpowered at rank 5 or
Which
tier
it
5,
objectively sort of was.
kind
Sort
of.
of is.
It's good. It's a good tank. The In World of Tanks, what they'd have to do is they'd have to basically move it up a tier, probably buff it a little bit, kind of shuffle around. They got to have a new tier 5 now. There's a lot of just moving parts that have to, because in the tier system, which I'll talk about in a moment, as kind of alternative methods that are in use. The tier system is kind of just a chain, and when you remove a piece, you have to insert a piece to kind of make it make sense, right? Or else you'll have gaps all around. If you put the War Thunder tech trees into chains like that, you would have a very, very certain battle rating. If you look at the American tanks, for example, there's a real collection of them at like 3.7, 4.0, a really good collection at 5.0, a good collection around like 6.3, 6.7. It's not very, it's not a fluid transition. There's not a 1.0, a 2.0, a 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, 6.0, things like that. That's just not the way it's organized. So one advantage of the battle rating system, as I was saying, is it's very easy to modify the rules that tanks are put into games with. Which kind of leads me to a disadvantage of this system, which is that by using, because the way battle ratings are determined are purely statistical. If a tank or a plane or whatever is doing exceptionally well, and I think the statistic they look at is survivability rate. I think how long a plane or a tank is active in a game kind of determines its battle rating. So a tank that, so in theory, there's lots of good examples for planes. Tanks, it's less so because tanks are kind of, well, planes are fragile too, but tanks are pretty fragile. There can be situations where a plane has an unfavorable playstyle or a tank has an unfavorable playstyle, but is in all regards better than, let's say, the next tank in the line, but is at a lower battle rating because the playstyle needed to play this tank is much easier than the playstyle needed to play another tank. So the tank with the easier playstyle will have a higher battle rating just because people generally will do better in it. People playing the maybe tough, harder tank to play, it'll likely have a lower battle rating even though it could be overall a better machine, simply because people generally don't do as well with that style of play. So that's kind of one disadvantage, is you can have these situations where, and it's not necessarily a fault of the battle rating system, it's more a fault of what main statistical category you draw your information from to determine where tanks should be, or planes. Maybe I should just say tanks, because that's basically all I really know a lot about in War Thunder. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what the battle rating system is. The other system we have prevalent in online multiplayer games of this genre is the tier system, which is basically stringing tanks together. Like I said earlier, in ranks, the tiers, I mean, Wargaming does tiers, Gaijin does battle ratings. You know, you have tier 1 through 10. Each tier is occupied by one machine, or maybe multiple, but every tier is occupied. And you have a plus or minus 1 tier battle rating system, or let's say battle rating, matchmaking system. So a tier 4 machine can see a tier 5 up to it's actually plus or minus 2 now that I think about it. A tier 4 can see up to a tier 6 or down to a tier 2, right? And then some scout tanks have a plus or minus 3. Well, they have a plus 3. There's no minus 3 to it. It's a plus 3. Because they'll always get into high-tier games.
Well, I mean, that has as much to do with the fact that there's a relatively small community of people that actually queue scout tanks.
I don't know.
Just like,
maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true. I think it's more so that light tanks don't go all the way up to tier 10.
No.
They go to tier 8.
Yeah. That probably influences too, but I mean, I'll just say in my experience, like, or at least my experiences in playing World of Tanks, there is certainly a dearth of light tanks as compared to the heavies and mediums.
Yeah.
Well, the only group less represented than light tanks is probably the SPGs, and that's because they're basically an entirely different game.
Yeah. So the tier system is that's kind of a high level of how the tier system works. You queue as a tier and a type of vehicle. The matchmaker tries to match up types of vehicles and tiers to other like types of vehicles and tiers to hopefully come up with a game where each team has the same number of each type of tank, and the tiers generally match up, or at least the tiers when you add them up are equal. So you might have a rank 3 and an extra rank 3, the other team might have an extra rank 4, but you have an extra rank 5 and the other team has one less rank 5. So if you add up all the tiers, it equals each other, is the goal. So
yeah, which I always had kind of an issue with. This is what I think one of the flaws of the tiered system is, that in matchmaking's efforts, using the tiers as kind of the pure metric to go by, it really does ignore some of the differences between the tanks. I've seen this a lot more in World of Warships than I recall seeing in World of Tanks, but you still see kind of the same story of, like, yeah, it's great that, we have a tier, we have a tier 6 battleship and they don't, but they also have 2 aircraft carriers to our one, and both those aircraft carriers are going to run our carrier over. Where you see like down tiers in certain places mean more than in others. So like battleships as an example, and again, referring to World of Warships because it's my more recent experience, like battleships can play at tiers above and below them. Meanwhile, destroyers can do all right, but cruisers kind of struggle in the sense that they don't have the guns or the armor to play with the big boys. So if they're getting outmatched, they're just outmatched. And for carriers, it's literal death. We've had videos on this channel where a single tier 7 carrier just rolls over a pair of tier 6s because there's just nothing they can do about it. So I think that's one of the key flaws of the tier system. That being said, I'm not sure the battle rating system necessarily fits the bill either, though I think it does give a little bit more precision to the matchmaker in terms of, let's try to get tanks that are at least as close as possible, rather than, well, we need another tier 5, so let's throw another light tank in there. And they have too many heavy tanks and we have too many, or they have a higher tier heavy tank, and there's a little bit more flexibility in the battle rating, I think.
Well, to your point about ships hitting above tier, I actually think battleships are, I think cruisers actually do okay. And the reason is that cruisers at large don't have armor anyway. Like a middle tier cruiser it doesn't have a tremendous amount of armor already. A high tier cruiser really doesn't have a lot of armor anyway. The only difference really comes down to the guns, and the caliber of the guns is actually very similar. It's 203 versus 152. So that is a difference. But a lot of times I feel, and especially nowadays with HE spam, it's...
Yeah, that's a fair point.
So I think cruisers do okay. I think battleships are, if I had to rank them, it would be carriers, then battleships, destroyers, and cruisers. Actually, I might put destroyers above cruisers. And the reason is
you're arguing cruisers have the least impact?
No, I'm arguing that battleships and carriers do. Carriers have the least overall. If a carrier is a tier down, it's very difficult for the carrier to win.
Okay.
A battleship that's tier down, it's not a given, but you need things to go your way, in my opinion. Or you need an exceptionally good battleship, or you need to be an exceptionally good player and take advantage of mistakes and things like that.
Or get a lucky shot.
Or get a lucky shot. Like if you Citadel penetrate them, that might be enough to make up the health difference or the armament difference or the armor difference that exists. But, those differences are generally not huge. They're generally not overpowering. Cruisers, I think I might rank next because, like I said, cruisers across the tiers, it basically comes down to the guns and the speed. Most cruisers are about the same speed. American cruisers are generally in the area of 30 knots. I haven't played a tremendous amount with the Japanese cruisers, but I imagine they're very similar. And armor generally isn't a consideration. Guns are usually the consideration. So it's kind of like 2 of the 3 things that you kind of rate something on are similar, if not the same. So it comes down to one factor. Now, and that one factor doesn't vary as much as it can with battleships. Because there are times when a 1 tier increase in battleship results in 60 extra millimeters of caliber on all the main guns, and you have the same number of main guns as your previous opponent. So that's why I think that. But then also destroyers, torpedoes always work. There's not really...
Yeah.
Torpedoes are always effective.
That's the reason
basically.
I think destroyers are the least... Yeah, I think I'd accept that the destroyers are least impacted. And we're getting a little bit off topic here.
Yeah, so I guess we can kind of draw it back.
Okay.
So I guess let's since the topic of this video is not battleships, I'm sorry. Is the battle rating system. So I think let's talk a little bit more about kind of maybe different ways of implementing the battle rating system. But before that, I think I will say that in terms of pure game design, I think the battle rating system actually makes more sense if done properly. Because
I agree with that. Like I think I said it earlier, but I want to just repeat it. The key difference is the battle rating system offers a lot more flexibility for the designers. You referenced the American tech tree. The American Shermans, the difference between an M4A1 and an M4A2, is one tier between that iteration, but there's also the M4 in between. And then you go up to the M4A176, and you're just not having, you have this nice clump of tanks around there, because it turns out they were all the same.
yeah, they're basically variations of the same thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
armor doesn't change, but I guess the reason for the battle rating jump is the gun change. So
Yeah, and that's just something a tier system can't do, because like you said, in World of Tanks, in a tier system, there is one tank at each tier.
or
Now,
or a
granted,
couple, but with your point stands.
There's a very limited number, and as you said, fine tuning is virtually impossible. I will say that the one of the restrictions it feels like that War Thunder has placed on itself is it's either point 0, point 0.3, or point 0.7.
There's very little yeah.
And I think you could, especially as the game gets larger, as you add in the British tanks and Japanese tanks, as you expand the tech trees, and you can still even expand the ones that are quote fully fleshed out, probably. You can start getting a little bit more precise and really starting to drill down, and having 6.2s or 5.6s. Just manipulating the tiers to build a healthy metagame based on the tanks. But to your point about changing the battle rating system, one thing I do think needs to be considered very strongly, and this is something that I can conceptually understand why War Thunder doesn't do it, but it's really frustrating, is this issue of being agnostic to the historical references of these tanks. I mean, the German players know immediately what I'm talking about, because the Germans are dealing with basically end of World War II era tanks, whereas the Americans are getting tanks that were developed post-war, or were basically developed at the very end of the war at the same battle rate, and the Russians the same way. If you can scream about Russian bias all you want, but the truth is the Germans weren't doing any tank development at the end of the war, so it's kind of in this, Gaijin has kind of walked themselves into a corner where they can't add the kind of German tanks you would need to balance out the battle tiers at the high end, because those tanks never existed because the Nazis lost the war.
Well, to some degree, but we see the Leo 1 coming in. That's a post-war tank.
Yeah, but that's basically a desperation move because they have to do something.
Well, it's actually it's less of one than you think, because it was prototyped and it was built by West Germany.
Yeah.
But it's in the same time frame as the M103, it's the T10, as other tanks that are making their way into the game. So it's not it's actually kind of a peer to those tanks. So it's kind of like you're just adding another kind of contemporary of those machines, but now it's German. So I actually don't think it's that weird. But I think the way you get around this whole this whole lack of tank development, and it's not that at the end of the war the Germans weren't designing tanks and trying to build tanks. They just ran out of resources and like the ability to fight in time. So you do have like the E series of tanks. You have the Mouse in the game, and then there has been speculation, I think it was confirmed, that in addition to the Leo 1, eventually we'll also see the E series, which is the E100, the E25, the E50, those tanks, which could be. The E100, I feel, would be an 8.0. The others might sit in the 7.0 range, depending on their armament and the guns and things like that. But they are basically end of World War II designs. The main issue you run into is if you want to build diversity at the high tiers, which is kind of where War Thunder falls apart in terms of, just in terms of matchmaking in general, is there's people generally congregate on a few different machines, which in the battle rating system means that, and less so that it's to say the battle rating system's agnostic. It's agnostic in the way that it doesn't care what battle rating machine it's putting into a game, just as long as it fits the bill. You know, which I will add to Gaijin's credit is something in a dev blog post not too long ago, and I'm speaking from memory now, so I can't say exactly what it spoke about. But one thing it did speak about was making the matchmaking system start caring about how many 8.0 battle rating tanks there are in the game. So it won't be a situation like it is currently where 8.0, where you could conceivably have a team that's full of 8.0 battle rating tanks fighting a team that's full of 7.0 battle rating tanks. In the current system, that's possible. In the system that was floated by on the dev blog, that would not be possible. So it's kind of a departure from... It would be kind of pushing it more towards the tier system, away from sort of... It would basically become more tier system than it currently is, if you kind of look at them side by side.
Yeah, but realistically, that's a very good choice by them to do.
Yeah, it's certainly a good choice.
Yeah, well, given that, we kind of said that the big advantage of the tier system was that it can balance, it can look at tiers and say, well, this team has 5 heavy tanks, so we need to give the other side 5 tier 5 heavy tanks, or the closest thing we can get to that. Like you were saying, the big issue right now with War Thunder's system is that we'll throw a bunch, because the Russians have a bunch of tier 8 or 8.0 tier 5 tanks. You can just get a whole team of those on one team. The Germans and Americans don't have as many, so it's not inconceivable that you'll get the 7.0 versus 8.0 battle. And since War Thunder insists on realistic and simulator modes to match nation versus nation rather than in arcade where it will mix teams, like there does need to be a system in place to try to regulate that, because I'm actually in War Thunder right now, just glancing around. The Americans have one 8.0?
I can actually tell you because I looked at this in my most recent review. I considered 7.7 as 8.0 for that purpose of that. There are 6 at the moment, pre 1.51. There are 6 Russian tanks that fit that bill, 7.7 to 8.0, because there's one T-54, which is 7.7 for some weird reason. Across all the other the other 2 nationalities, so Americans and Germans, there are 3 total. So you have a 2-to-1 split in favor of Russian tanks. And I think, and my thoughts on that, just as a quick sidebar, is it's almost like the thing is that these games, these online, tank simulation games, actually really lend themselves to what the Russian tanks are good at.
Yeah, their play style is relatively simple and conceptually easy to understand. And
well, it's not just that. The maps are, and it's not because I don't think it's Russian bias that the maps are the way they are, because some are very wide open, and you generally see like M103s just slaughtering people in big open fields, because that's what the M103 is really good at. But on maps like Karelia, Kuban, some of the others, it's difficult for M103s. It's basically difficult for American and German tanks to really stand up against tanks that are all pretty quick, all pretty decently armored, if not well armored, and have powerful guns. But that's a sidebar. That's probably a different discussion. So, in terms of making the battle rating system better, because my thought is that I generally don't like it, but the issue is I don't know enough to say that it needs to go, or if it is easily fixed, because I don't think it's as easily fixed as people think. Partly because there needs to be just more variation in the game itself, which is which is just development side. That just takes time. A lot of people suggest making the battle rating spread for matchmaking 0.7, which I think could be interesting, but I'm not sure. As it stands currently, it doesn't doesn't really. I don't think it really solves anything. And
Yeah, I was. You told me about this. Sorry to cut you off,
yeah,
but
it's fine.
the I don't. I can see why that is a conceptual idea because it's hey, I'm getting tired of getting my. I'm in my tier 7, whatever. I'm tired of getting my teeth kicked in by an IS-4, which historically speaking, my tank never would have seen. And no crap, it's going to beat me because it's a way better tank fundamentally speaking. But the issue with changing that battle rating system like that, narrowing the range, number one, you're going to affect matchmaking times, and one of the biggest problems I feel developers have is in an online game like this is managing matchmaking times because your community are no offense because but we're players too. Like gamers are basically infants. They're very selfish, very greedy, and they will cry, piss, and moan the first chance they get. So if you start having 5-minute queue times, people are going to start raging, and that's going to be especially bad for the Russians because it's probably hard enough to get a game in an IS-4 or T-54.
Well, not really, but your point stands that if you lower the battle rating to a point where they only see like 2 tanks, you would have Russian teams it would be a team full of Russians versus a team with like full of M103s or like Mouses or something like that. It just would not be compelling late. I mean, and that's already the late tier sort of games are not compelling at all because there's just so little variety, and the outcome, while not being as set in stone as it has been in the past, as I found when I was gathering clips for the SU-122-54 review, it still is a greater than likely chance that the Russian teams will win. Now, it's not as great as it was. There was a time when I think when I did my Yag Tiger review way back in the day when it was an 8.0 and it's sort of the earlier stage.
You tell me it was basically like a
I think I thought it was pretty good to have a double-digit win rate in a German machine at that tier, so 10% or higher. And I think the best I ever got in it was 11%. And that's just the way it was.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I don't know. I could go look at the statistics, but I think it's actually better, but it's still not. It's still nowhere near balanced. It's still not an even split like you want. But my biggest concern about making the battle ratings 0.7 based is one. I think you do need to. Part of it is that the fundamental issue I have with the battle rating system, I guess just to say it, is that it encouraged people to play specific tanks, which happens already in a tier system. You'll have more people queue in the previous KV-1S when it had the 122mm gun and just absolutely derped everybody. Lots of people queued in it.
Yeah.
But it was very rare that a game was just overrun by them. There was never, at least, partly because
you would never
tanks,
have a 12-on-12ers, 12
yeah,
KV-1Ss
it would never
versus,
happen. You would have rank 4s in there. You would have rank 5s in there. You'd have some rank 7s maybe. There would be a split, Well, you wouldn't have a rank 7, but you see the point. There would be a split just because would just split all these KV-1Ss up.
Was mixing and matching. Which
it would mix
like
and match and make...
To.
Yeah, and make kind of a more even game that way. Or, well, I mean, I guess if everyone's driving KV-1Ss, it's pretty even. But...
Yeah. That's just a derp fest.
Yeah, but for example, if I wanted to play, 6 point, well, let's say I wanted to play like 5.0 to 4.0 range. Basically, I'm saying that if I want to play in I'll say the middle tiers, like the middle battle rating, like 5.0 ish.
Yeah.
You basically need to play a Hellcat, in my opinion, to really stand a chance of having a chance.
Yeah,
you can
be playing a Hellcat or something that's specifically like.
Well, it's not even something that counters it because there isn't really a counter. But my point is that people are encouraged to play specific tanks and just spam the shit out of them.
Yeah.
Which to me makes really boring games. It basically means I can only reasonably play and have a chance in about 3 machines. which is part of the reason why I like the 3.7 battle rating, because it's isolated enough and there's enough diversity there that you can actually play a lot of different tanks there.
Yeah.
And hopefully you don't run into a game with 4.7 tanks where you have a ton of Hellcats in the game. But it's low
Yeah.
enough that that doesn't happen very much. So that's why I like that battle rating a lot, because there's actually diversity. And I think that's what the game kind of needs to move to, is the diversity we have at that battle rating. The issue is that obviously early on in the
Well,
thing.
I mean, that kind of raises an interesting point that in the tier system, there are so few tanks at any one tier. I mean, because help me remember, but there was never more than 2 tanks at one tier for a
I
nation,
think the
right?
most there was is 3.
Okay, there are some 3. Yeah, I guess there were some
Well,
3s.
yeah.
So, I mean, you're looking at, at any one
For a
tier
particular
you have,
line of tank, like medium
Yeah.
tanks, they're at, because I mean, the example I can think of is tier 10 Russian mediums. There's 3 of them.
Yeah. Okay, but that still means there might be a max of 15 different tanks to play, and there's going to be optimizations, and there's going to be you're going to have a mix of heavies and mediums. So that's something that I think the tier system naturally does, because you're going to play the good. You only have a few choices. War Thunder, you have a larger number of choices, but you're still going to naturally have the min-max optimization, because that's what players do. And for Gaijin or anybody to say, well, we don't want our players to do that, it's like, well, then you don't want players, because that's what players do.
Players min max, and I'm actually, that would actually be an interesting exercise to determine which tank, like at one tier, which game has more diversity, because I don't think it's given, like you said. Like, for example, World of Tanks has more nationalities in it. Has Americans, British, Germans, Russians, French, and Japanese. So in theory, there's 4 classes. The Japanese obviously don't have all 4. They only have 1 class, and the Chinese, who I forgot to mention, have, I think, 2 classes. But the point is that in theory, if all tech trees were fleshed out, you would have 4 tanks from each nationality you could possibly play at one tier. And you have a plus or minus 2 tier system. So in theory, you could have however many we decided on that times excess tiers. Right? So I think the diversity actually may be favored that way, or I mean, I would have to do.
I think it. Just back of the envelope map, the tier system lends itself to more diversity, but that also has to do with the way wargaming has decided to conduct their business. Gaijin, we've talked about, has been very focused on realistic tanks, and I hate to break it to you, but the IS-3 was more or less designed with the understanding of what the German tanks were, to kill the shit out of them. So that's why they kill the shit out of them.
That was the ultimate goal, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's the problem Gaijin runs into, is they want to play this. They want to design this realistic tank sim, this beautiful game where you can say what would happen. You run your Tiger up against Shermans, and the Tiger wins, because that's what the Tiger did. Then you take the tanks that the Allies built to answer the Tiger, and they wreck the Tiger. And so,
or at least they have a fair fight, or it comes down to whoever fires first.
Yeah, exactly. So, the tier system, because wargaming is willing to manipulate the numbers and basically say, we're not concerned about having the most realistic tank game. We want to have a competitive, balanced one. I mean, mission accomplished. They're going to have more diversity, because they can say, well, the Japanese tanks aren't getting played, so let's tweak a couple of numbers, maybe fix some armor, and maybe even find a historical justification to do it so we don't look like swine, and, get it fixed.
Kind of maybe fudge some numbers, maybe work some angles on it, and make them more viable. I would definitely agree that the balance factor in World of Tanks is much higher. In terms of just, I think if you took a tank's win rate on average, it would be across the tiers it would be about the same. But the thing is, I don't know statistically if that's even. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. But whereas in War Thunder, there's plenty of tanks that statistically across all players would have tremendously low differing battle rating or differing win rates, to the point where.
Yeah, well, you've already kind of referenced. The big obvious one, which is that you were playing the Jagd Tiger back before it was changed, and it was literally a case of if you won 10% of your games, you were a god.
Not even that. That was just, I think, statistical average for myself.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if somebody's going to make the argument, say, oh, well, Corny Swiss isn't very good at this game, because he's got a shit win rate, be like, I don't know about that. I don't know if I buy that logic.
Yeah, and I'm not great. I'm okay.
So you're good enough that you're not going to have a 10% win rate on a tank unless it's utter garbage.
Or I'm just garbage at playing it, but usually you're correct. I don't think I will have a 10% win rate on a tank unless there is something fundamentally wrong with the level of competition or maybe the machine itself. But yeah, I guess the key, but the thing is that like you mentioned, that Gaijin's kind of wants to make this realistic tank game, and
which for the record I do support. I think it's
cool. I think it's a good idea. The problem is I'm not sure, practicality's sake, if that will kind of take over the marketplace. Yeah. But I guess to where this is kind of one massive tangent.
Is, do players want to play a realistic tank sim where, like in Real War, if your Sherman was driving down a ditch or whatever, and a tiger rolled up and faced you, you were just dead. Like, just get out of the tank and run, because that's about the only option you have.
Yeah, and that just doesn't do well with online multiplayer gaming.
Yeah, because people want to feel like they have a chance, and the truth is, well,
sometimes you don't.
The fact of life is that in war there are plenty of times where if the bad guy's doing the right thing, so to speak, the bad guy quote is doing the right thing, you're just dead. There's nothing to be done.
But to kind of take it back to the battle rating system and maybe kind of wrap up. Yeah. We discussed one alternative, the 0.7 spread, which I think both of us agree isn't really an answer, but because part of it is it doesn't change which tanks are strong and which tanks people are going to play, and if anything, it makes it so that those tanks can dominate their respective tiers more. A Hellcat who doesn't run into, part of the problem is the Hellcat already has no armor, has tremendous speed, has a great gun, and can actually whip its high-tier opposition, the 5.7s and things like that, or the 6.0s. But you run into a situation where you start to group some tanks that are already really strong into tiers where they already dominate their opposition at their own tier, at their native tier. So you've just made it so that now the tanks that were in that native tier to that machine that's OP, or well, maybe not OP, but just stronger.
You're complaining that this guy's a big fish at a tier, so your solution is to shrink
make it a smaller
tier.
Pond.
Yeah, you make it a smaller pond. That's not the answer. That just means they're a bigger fish in a smaller pond.
I think conceptually the battle rating system actually isn't as bad as people kind of give it credit for. The issue is that the matchmaker needs the overhaul that Gaijin are giving it, from what I remember the dev blog. The matchmaker is the key problem, not the system. I don't think the battle rating system is inherently bad. I actually think it's, honestly, in a game that's in rapid development phase, which War Thunder is, according to the devs and also just by looking at it, I think it's entirely reasonable to come up with a system where it mimics what tiers do, a tier system does, but allows tanks to be shuffled around as needed. However, they need to be shuffled around on more than just survivability statistics. In theory, that's the one statistic I guess you could look to, but it just doesn't. It's not it's practical to look at one statistic, but it's not good. It doesn't tell you the whole story. And one statistic like kill-death ratio or whatever is not going to tell you the whole story. You need to look at a collection of statistics. It's kind of like how the stock market works. You look at an index, which is a collection of different items. That's how I think. So I guess to sum up my argument on the battle rating system, since we went on big tangents, but that's what this video is for. It's mainly a ramble, a focused ramble. My general opinion is that I think the battle rating system fundamentally is not bad. I hesitate to say good, but the reason I hesitate is because of the back end the back end techniques used to determine a tank's position in the battle rating system, and also the way the MM is structured at the current moment, which is subject to change, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah.
If the back end management of how tanks are battle rated and the way MM functions fundamentally, I think the battle rating system is just as good as a tier system because it essentially accomplishes the same thing but allows more flexibility on the side of the developers.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think to kind of sum my point, I can accept the premise that the battle rating system is not ideal, but I hazard to guess that there isn't an ideal system given what Gaijin is trying to do, which is create a realistic tank sim where you have tanks that historically were designed to kill each other. You have tanks that were designed to defeat another tank. That was the whole point. So, reducing the battle rating spread to 0.7, I feel doesn't really answer the fundamental problem of you have tanks, like you said, that are just preferred at that tier. That's not the answer. Isn't to make this pond smaller; it's to make the pond bigger, but in a way that makes sense. So expanding it to 2.0 is not going to be the answer either. Really, the answer is you need more fish, and either Gaijin needs to let go of the idea of a realistic tank sim, which I don't think they should do, or they need to add in more tanks, which it sounds like they're doing with the E-Series. They at least seem to be making an honest effort to balance out something. But something I wanted to say is kind of a final point for me. I'm not a game designer, but in my mind, if I was designing a competitive multiplayer game, I would view it as pretty much a failure on my part if my players were able to completely optimize the game to the point where they're playing one vehicle out of, say, 10. Like, I can accept that there are always going to be the goods and the bads and playstyles and metagame because that's how the world works. But there should never be just one macro good choice because that's just not good game design in my opinion. But I'm not a game designer, so Gaijin probably has thought of all this and at least made an effort. But we'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
So let us know what you think of this pilot episode. Feedback is heavily encouraged, good or bad. Topics for another one are heavily encouraged.
Mostly because we don't know what to talk about either.
Yeah. We kind of scraped the barrel, I think, for this topic. But yeah, so let us know. Thanks for watching. I've been Corny Swiss.
And I'm Corny Phil.
And we'll see you next time.